Many conflict photographers make compelling work that helps enforce or change the narrative of the wars they're creating images of. This photographer helped to impact feelings about the Vietnam War, not only through his photos, but through the heavily considered writings that he made about what he had seen firsthand. As the longest-standing president of Magnum, he also heavily influenced the world of street and documentary photography in a number of different ways. This is Insight for Inspiration, Philip Jones Griffiths. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation. Philip was born in Wales in 1936. He began his life as a photographer at the age of 14. Shortly thereafter, his photography became more serious when he began to read Picture Post, a photojournalism magazine published in the UK from 1938 to 1957. And by joining his first camera club, his experience grew through the remainder of his teenage years, through images of Wales, wedding photography, and working as a photographer at a local camp. Reflecting on this period of his life, he said, "I got all that beautiful landscape stuff out of the way in North Wales, and I was ready for the rest of the world." For his university years beginning in 1959, he relocated to Liverpool to pursue a degree in pharmacy, while working as a freelance photographer on the side for the Sunday Times, The Guardian, and The Observer. In 1961, he had become a full-time photographer working mostly freelance for The Guardian. This allowed him to start on his way to photographing the rest of the world, when he made his way to create images of Northern Ireland, the war in Algeria, and events in Zambia, Israel, and Cambodia. These photos are what set the trajectory for the rest of his career. The work Griffiths created in the 1950s and the early 1960s came together in the exhibition called Middle Years, a name given for the fact that the images were created in the middle of the century. The photos he created during this time period were out of an instinct to escape boredom that he feared would follow him throughout his life if he forever remained in Wales, stating that, "My only fear in life was and is boredom, and it could get pretty boring there. I was made aware that magazines dedicated to photography existed, so I started devouring everything that I could find on the subject, and it didn't take long to discover that there was something called Magnum. I became aware that photographers ran around the world like samurai or Zen warriors with a Leica around their neck, and changed the world. At least, if not changing it, then showing the world to people in a way that enabled them to make changes. And that seemed to be a magical thing to be able to do. You have access to everything. If I woke up tomorrow morning and said, I really want to know what the social conditions in Dubai are like for the poor there, I can get on a plane, go there, and find out for myself. There are very few professions that allow you to do that. To get access to the life he was seeking, he found that getting photos published in The Observer or Guardian was the best thing that he could do, because these photos always came with a photo credit, and those credits would lead to more highly paying jobs. He also found that it was necessary to avoid the easy and obvious news stories, but to find stories with loose connections to those other stories that everyone else was covering. Reflecting on this later in his life, he stated, "What I've long since discovered with Magnum is that the photographer who says, 'I've got a great story,' generates much more interest from picture editors than a photographer saying, 'Here are the pictures from the assignment you gave me.'" The majority of his work created during this time was all made with an English copy of the Rolleiflex that he says had an extremely loud shutter sound. While the medium format images it could produce could easily be cropped to get a more compelling image, he refused to do that, stating that the influence Bresson had on his work made him disregard cropping in exchange for getting the framing right in camera. Working with this machine taught him the skills that were necessary for finding success in street and documentary photography. It has a lot to do with who you are, and the way you behave, how calm you are, what your body language is, and the incredible ability to feign yawns so everybody thinks you're bored. And then, you look at your watch, and you've got your picture. These techniques were used to capture images of English streets, museums, public gatherings, political events, protests, and the Beatles. They laid the foundation to establish his voice as a photographer that would go on to impact the world in a way he sought to do from the beginning. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation, a plugin to help photographers and videographers achieve the look of film through digital means within the following software. For more information on how Dehancer can help you achieve the look of film on your frames by adding authentic and tested looks, compression, grain, halation, bloom, and more, check the link in the description. Philip visited over 140 countries throughout the course of his career to document the human condition in life and war. One of the first that he stepped into outside of the United Kingdom was Algeria. A war for independence began in the country after World War II, when France hadn't gathered the sovereign status that they had promised to the country. As the war went on, civilians were forcibly moved into camps as France napalmed the countryside. Philip was the first to capture images of these camps. They had been only rumored up to that point. These photos are what launched his career as a conflict photojournalist and allowed him to create images in all of the countries that he would go on to visit. While there's limited information on the other countries Philip documented in the early parts of his career, namely Zambia and Israel, the most significant body of work he created was made in Vietnam, which is backed up by the book Vietnam Inc. It was in Phnom Penh that he photographed Jackie Kennedy on a holiday, which gave him enough money to finance the work that he would create in Vietnam. The conflicts in Vietnam caused Griffiths to draw a comparison to it and Goya's nightmarish paintings. Bresson also made this comparison about the images he created in Vietnam, stating, "Not since Goya has anyone portrayed war like Philip Jones Griffiths. He captured images of the war from 1966 to 1970 that played a big part in changing public perceptions when they were put together in the book Vietnam Inc., which was released in 1971. According to Magnum's website, Vietnam Inc. was crucial in changing public attitudes in the United States, turning the tide of opinion, and ultimately helping to put an end to the Vietnam War. The power of this book was later summed up in a statement from Noam Chomsky, when he claimed, "If anybody in Washington had read that book, we wouldn't have had these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan." All of Philip's insights were broken down into 9 different sections. Because this work was paramount to all he created throughout his life, it's important to dive into it and show how the verbiage of what he created persuaded the shift in feelings about the war, and how similar work could have a similar impact, if done correctly by documentary photographers today, in terms of whatever it is that they're documenting, if those things carry any kind of similar weight. In the first of these sections, he speaks about the Vietnamese people and the changes the war forced upon them. According to Philip, prior to the war for hundreds of years, so much of Vietnamese life revolved around growing rice, and as a result, it was the cornerstone of their social identity. He wrote, "Rice is a staple diet, but it is more than a food to the Vietnamese. It is their purpose for existing. A symbiosis exists between the society's religious beliefs, its moral values, and its task of growing rice. To a Vietnamese, each meal has some of the significance that eating communion bread has for a Catholic. Nowadays, American rice has to be sent to Vietnam to feed those driven from their land. The people hate it. They try to sell it for pig food to get money to buy what Vietnamese rice is available." After continuing to ruminate on how the war had transformed life for the rural Vietnamese people, Philip explains his feelings about Americans' involvement in the country through a section titled, "Why We're There." He reflected on his feelings about the situation in relation to English expansionism into Wales. Although this happened in the distant past, it was still a cultural memory for his people. He felt that every time an American criticized the Vietnamese, the criticism was based on a self-righteous sense of natural superiority, derived from the unquestioning belief in an American monopoly of all higher morality. Or in other words, that Americans felt, "We are here to help the Vietnamese help themselves." He goes on to explain how devastating search and destroy was for the people of Vietnam, in its forced relocation, clearing of lands, and slaughtering of the people. So much was lost for the Vietnamese. He summed up the outcome of this campaign stating, "What is likely to happen, judging by past experience, is that the population of Song Tra will slowly decrease. The disintegration of the old village society has already taken place, with the disappearance of communal administration and religious ties. The fear and uncertainty which now holds the people together in Song Tra will lessen when, as time passes, the popular forces lose interest and enthusiasm, and people will be able to slip away. Families will begin to split up, and the village, as the fulcrum of Vietnamese society, will be destroyed forever. Wives and mothers will seek their husbands and their sons in nearby Viet Cong areas. Some farmers will become fishermen. Others will head to the American camps once they realize how easy it is to extract money from the GIs. The prettier girls will have no difficulty getting work, whether it be dusting, in the officers' quarters at a nearby battalion, or in the rapidly expanding brothels over the river. One girl had already set herself up in the engine room of the landing craft used by the ferry GIs across the river, at $1 for each 5-minute trip. She was earning more in a week than her father probably earned in all of his life. The cause of the breakdown in society which permits such prostitution and delinquency to flourish does not go unnoticed by the Vietnamese people, and according to some, it has become one of the most successful platforms in the Viet Cong recruiting program. He goes on to explain the larger problems of the war as the realistic failings of America began to seep through the cracks. According to Griffiths, to the people of South Vietnam and America, Tet, 1968, marked the point when the American involvement in Vietnam lost its credibility. What the Tet and May offensives did was to negate the central promise on which the logic of this relocation policy was based. This is that the urban center, our haven from death and destruction, meted out to those still living in the countryside. In the spring of 1968, this fallacy was exposed. The sacrifices villagers had made in leaving their ancestral lands for the horrors of city life were in vain. With grim irony, the very same pilots who had bombed them out of the countryside were now bombing them in the cities. The sanctuaries were no more. Griffiths made it evident that America was losing the war because they wouldn't come around to the impact of guerrilla warfare, and that he felt was only surprising to those who continued to believe US media outlets that were telling people otherwise. He summed up his feelings overall in this statement: "The war in Southeast Asia revealed a true American foreign policy as it has never been seen before. For more than 10 years, the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth tried everything short of nuclear weapons to defeat a nationalist, revolutionary movement in a small nation of poor rice farmers. And they failed. Despite the slaughter, the people triumphed. America had the smart bombs, but the Vietnamese had the smart minds. The battle was between technology and human beings, and the human beings won." Being British and a photographer, I had a privileged overview of the contest. I spent 5 years immersed in Vietnam, trying to make sense of what was going on. All that was needed was a cool head, a sharp eye, and a modicum of humanity to qualify as a serious observer. My book, Vietnam Inc., examined every aspect of the war, and I hope helped illuminate the subject. At times, the Vietnam War, like all wars, had the drama of forces of darkness murdering the innocents. The task, of course, was to see beyond the obvious. All wars produce the familiar iconic images of horror, which do little to further anyone's understanding of the particular conflict. My purpose was to understand the nature of the war and to reveal the truth about it, with photographs providing the visual proof. The photographs are the evidence. In so many wars and conflicts all over the world, we see the breaking news, the bombings that ignite decades-long fighting, and the immediate impact it has on a place. As time goes on, our attention turns elsewhere, and we become less and less concerned about what's happening in a place. Griffith's book, Agent Orange, attempts to do the opposite. He spent so much time in Vietnam covering what was happening there throughout the 60s that he had to go back and document the lasting impacts it had on the country, mostly through the children and grandchildren of its survivors. With new atrocities taking place in the world now, and breaking news that can easily send anyone towards the feelings that we're on the brink of absolute horrific times on a global scale, it's important to look back on how the past really always continues to repeat itself, and what we can potentially do to break out of this cycle of violence, pain, and suffering. Thanks to Dehancer for sponsoring this video. If you want to know how to use their plugin to get the look of film on your digital photo and video, check the link in the description. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep developing.